Well, good morning, everyone. This is Josh Bledsoe from Latham Watkins, and welcome to our legal workshop at NACW 2021. We are the guinea pigs here. This is our first session, I think the first session for the new virtual platform that NACW is using this year. So we think we have it figured out, but please bear with us. We're going to get underway and just see a number of people are still joining the session, but just as kind of an introduction, this is a workshop that Latham Watkins has done a number of years at the NACW conference, typically in person. It's usually a pre-conference workshop focusing on key legal issues. We're delighted to be invited by Climate Action Reserve, so thank you, Climate Action Reserve, for having us. We typically do this session over 3 to 4 hours. Every year there's more to talk about, more interesting things happen in the climate space. This year, because of COVID and the virtual platform, we're doing an hour. So it's a little bit of a different format, as much of a deep dive. We have an hour, and we're going to survey 3 different topics today. And those topics in order are the 45Q federal tax credits, which you've probably heard a lot about in the news, that are available for carbon capture and sequestration projects. And my partner, Jim Cole, out of our Houston office, is going to cover those. Marcus, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, as we get to the different segments. And I'm going to cover hydrogen issues, another hot topic right now. A lot of discussion about hydrogen, even today, with President Biden's announcement about the nationally determined contribution for the United States with the Paris Treaty. There's a reference to hydrogen, so we'll cover some of those hydrogen issues. And then third, we're going to return to a topic that we've done before at the legal workshop, which is actually the intersection of the California Environmental Quality Act, which is a land use planning tool in the state of California, and climate issues. Those involve offsets and the cap and trade program. And so we're delighted to have Mark Kim, one of our partners in the Orange County office where I sit at Latham, and Mark's back to talk about this issue again. There's a more recent case that came out, which we think is really important for the market to understand in terms of that intersection between land use and climate issues and offsets. And so with that, we're a couple minutes over. Show the agenda here. This is us. This is boring. This is just our headshots, right, and our contact information. Again, feel free to contact us at any time if you want to have a discussion about what we talk about today. Again, it's a pretty short format today. We usually have a lot of back in the discussion. We have 3 or 4 hours, and we'll do some of that. We've reserved some time at the end for that. But again, don't hesitate to reach out if you want to talk further. I think with that, I would love to turn it over to Jim and let Jim introduce himself and start the program.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So as Josh said, my name's Jim Cole. I'm a partner in Latham's Houston office. I focus my practice primarily on tax incentives for renewable energy, M&A related to oil and gas, and then lately kind of the intersection of those two, which is the Section 45Q tax credit, capture and sequestration. So, Patty, if we could go maybe to slide 4. I think our agenda, at least on 45Q, is going to cover kind of 2 disparate topics. One is a brief summary of how you 45Q and kind of what the program is about. And the second is how you finance a project using 45Q tax credits. So, high level, 45Q has been around thousands. The program expanded very significantly in the year 2018. It now provides a per metric ton tax credit for carbon dioxide that's captured, and then that is either sequestered permanently using secure geological storage, sequestered in an enhanced oil recovery project using secure geological storage, or utilized in any other commercial market that the IRS, effectively certifies as a sufficient commercial market. The 2018 expansion did a couple of things. The first was it significantly increased the dollar value of the credits. They now go up to $35 for CO2 that's sequestered in an EOR project or that's used in another commercial manner, and up to $50 for sequestered permanently. This, is really, I think, something though that's a bit of a moving target. There's been a number of proposals really from both sides of the aisle in the last couple of weeks about expanding or otherwise reshaping the program. Some of them have seen up to even $100 or more, in particular where direct air capture is the source. So lucrative credits today, and by all accounts going to become more lucrative, I think, in the next couple of years. The credits available for the year that the equipment is placed in service, and I'll touch on this a little later. There's a 2026 date in the statute by which you have to begin construction. That is actually a very liberal standard for the IRS. So when you think about you begin in 2026, complete within 6 years, and then you're earning credits for 12 years after that. So, we realistically, under the current program, will see 45Q credits claimed up through the 2030s, and then, subject to any extension thereafter. So I typically break down into three components. The IRS released a set of rules back in January, interpreting a lot of aspects of 45Q, and there's a lot of terms of art that kind of interplay in the different components, but I think you can break it down high level. The first is you need a good source of CO2. The second is you need to add carbon capture equipment to that source. And the third is you need a good use of the CO2. So a good source, there's really two. First is direct air capture, which I think is, effectively taking CO2 out of the ambient air. And the second is an industrial facility. This was something that we did, we received clarity on back in the January guidance. An industrial facility is a manufacturing process that produces really any other commercial. You sell it at a profit, or something that you use in another commercial manner. And then an industrial facility can also include a fugitive carbon emission source. The IRS actually didn't tell us what that meant when they came out with the final rules. So I think, in the tax bar, the verdict is whether we would get, to any sort of comfort level and what that really means to have a fugitive source. So we are seeing, as the market develops, projects focus on really the manufacturing facility aspect. So in other words, we're making something, we're emitting CO2, and we want to capture it. You also need the CO2 to be both measurable at the source of capture and then verified at the point of disposal, or injection or utilization. The second major prong is that you need to add carbon capture. So again, like I said, you have to begin construction on your carbon capture equipment before the year 2026. The IRS here adopted the standard that they used in the wind and solar industries, as those industries have developed over the last 10 or so years for beginning construction for or investment tax credits. And there's two ways that you begin. The first is you incur 5% of project costs, and that's kind of the safe harbor method. That can be quite. Am I back? Can somebody? Can people hear me now? All right, there. I got a confirmation. I'm sorry about that. Thanks for bearing with us, everyone. So I think I was on carbon capture equipment. So I think the way we're going to see people qualify projects is the second kind of IRS standard, which is they begin physical work of a significant nature. That's a very low bar. So really we expect that people will, do a pretty minimal amount of work kind of leading up to the 2026 date if they're looking at that as their project timeline. The third requirement for 45Q is that you need a good use of the CO2. There's three. The first is, like I said, that you permanently sequester the CO2 using secure geological storage. This is effectively injection into underground reservoirs. It requires compliance with the EPA's UIC program. which my understanding from Josh and Mark and others is what that ultimately means is Class 6 wells in an MRV plan on file with the EPA. The second good use is a tertiary injectant in an enhanced oil recovery project. That is for UIC purposes either a Class 2 or a Class 6 well potentially, but ultimately does also require an MRV plan. And then the last is the CO2 can be used in any other commercial manner. We haven't really seen this aspect of the market develop yet. I think this is going to be the third that follows, just because the technology for using CO2 in other commercial manners is not as well developed. And when we talk about tax equity on the next slide, those investors tend to like to invest in technology that they can understand and that's been tested. The last aspect I'd mention on the overall program is the credits are subject to recapture if you use secure storage. And what that means is if the CO2 leaks, then you have to pay the value of the credit back to the IRS. It's subject to recapture for up to 3 years after any given year that you claim the credit. So effectively, on a 12-year program, a 15-year tail on liability. Patty, could we hit the next slide, please? So the next question is, once you know that you qualify for the program, how do you make use of the credit? I'll cover this one quickly, but 45Q credits aren't refundable. So what that means is that you need to actually have a tax liability in order to receive value for the credit. Many of these projects are being developed by startup or other, relatively small investors that don't have a tax liability sufficient to utilize the credit. So the strategy that they're using is they bring in a tax equity investor. This is a lot like what it sounds. It's an equity investor in the project that realizes their return based on an allocation of tax attributes. The structure that is being employed is called a flip partnership structure, which is a structure that's been used in wind and solar for about 15 years. Effectively, the way a flip partnership works is tax equity will make an upfront investment at the time that the project's placed into service. The amount of that investment is sized so that the investor will realize a specific yield at a specific date. So it may be that they size to receive a 7% yield after 8 years or a 10% yield after the 12-year credit term. Those are, negotiation points that are kind of project specific. Prior to reaching that yield, the tax investors allocated 99% of benefits and 99% of tax credits and is given some amount of cash. After they realize the yield, the economics flip and the sponsor takes 95% of tax income and attributes and, a larger amount of cash from there on out. So the investor can realize their yield 3 ways: tax credits, tax deductions, and cash distributions. In February of this year, the IRS put out a template, or February of last year rather, put out a template for safe harbor partnerships that contains a number of very specific provisions or very specific features that they like to see. If you follow their template, what it effectively tells you is that they will not challenge the status of the tax equity investor as a partner in the partnership, and they will also not challenge the allocation of credits. A couple of high-level points from that template. 20% of the tax equity's projected investment is expected to be made in an upfront contribution. 30% can be deferred but fixed in amount, and 50% can be contingent on project performance. We call that last bucket pay-go contributions for sort of a pay-as-you-go concept. You are permitted to guarantee certain supply and offtake agreements, but the sponsor generally can't guarantee. critical to ensuring you have a good project. And then the last is, unlike the wind and solar space, the sponsors are not permitted to have a call option on the project equity once the flip is realized. Rather, tax equity is permitted to have a put option. So the market's still kind of out on how that one shakes out in terms of whether people really utilize the put option or they come up with some other mechanism to try and permit an exit for the investor post-flip. So with that, I'll pause. I'm a few minutes over. Appreciate you bearing with me on the technical hurdles, and I think I will pass it over to Josh.
Thank you, Jim. All right, so took a little while there to unmute. And I think I put this into the chat function, but if folks have questions, I mean, please put your questions in the Q&A tab on the right. So it's on the right side, at least on my screen. So anything that we're talking about, any other related issue you want to ask about, I mean, we can wait to the end and potentially try to open up if we can do that, but also please put questions into the Q&A tab. So Patty, maybe we can advance to the next slide here. So I was going to cover hydrogen. First, I should want to say hello to a number of folks that I see that are in the session today. There's a lot of familiar names there. So wish I could see all of you in person, hopefully next year. So I wanted to talk about hydrogen because there's been a lot of talk about hydrogen and what it can do to help decarbonize the global economy. And so I'm going to cover hydrogen really in 3 different sectors. And the truth is some of these kind of overlap. But I want to cover hydrogen on the power side, so power generation, transport, and then also hydrogen as a potential replacement fuel for hard to decarbonize industrial processes. And I guess before I get into that, I should probably tell you a bit about who I am. I kind of skipped over that. So I'm a lawyer in the Orange County office of Latham Watkins. I sit in the Environmental Land and Resources Department. When we used to have cocktail parties, I would tell people that I'm a climate change lawyer. So a lot of what I do is in the carbon market. I do a lot of work, thinking about how our clients can best monetize the low carbon attributes of their products or services. And that's really the fun stuff that we do. And we're doing more and more of it every year. So I work a lot with Jim on the tax credit side, on CCS projects where he's handling the tax credits. And I'm looking a lot on the carbon credit side under the LCFS and other types of programs. And I guess we have a visitor from my daughter here. Say hi, Sophie. Let's start with hydrogen in the power sector. The most interesting thing about hydrogen is its potential to be a large-scale solution to what a lot of you have probably seen on the screen here, which is what we call the duck curve. The chart on the right is, some people say it looks a little bit like a duck with the head on the right, the belly at the bottom, the tail on the left. And what this the x-axis, what it's showing you is the hours of the day, 0 to 24. And then on the y-axis, you're seeing the megawatt hours of net load on the system. And this is CAISO. This is the California ISO, grid. And what you're seeing is over time, the belly of the duck is getting bigger. And what that means is you're seeing overgeneration of renewables. At certain times of the day. It's the times of the day you would expect, right? When the sun is at its highest point in the sky, you're getting a lot of solar overgeneration. And then just as the solar is going offline, as the sun goes down, people are getting home, turning on their TVs, turning on their air conditioners, and you get this ramp. Generally, natural gas-fired generation pretty long. At that time to hit that ramp as you go up the neck of the duck. And so, there's been a lot of different things. There's demand response programs. You're seeing a lot of battery storage come online with lithium ion. But one of the interesting things about hydrogen is its chemical storage. It can be chemical storage of renewable energy. And it's almost infinitely scalable, right? The idea is you can take the excess renewable electricity, do electrolysis, whether you're storing it underground reserves or whether you are putting it into the pipeline system. And so one thing I should note here is that there's a panel later in the conference that's going to cover this exact issue. And bear with me for 1 second. Okay, and I'm back. The joys of working at home. So the interesting thing about hydrogen is you could potentially store for more than just hourly. You can store on the weekly, monthly, even a seasonal basis. And so that's really regarding hydrogen is the ability to store on longer terms. And that electricity, I mean, that hydrogen that can maybe then go back to a natural gas-fired generator or so on and so forth. And you can see with the bar chart there, it's pretty apparent that you're having increased what we call curtailments of solar, wind and solar electricity in CAISO. And that's increasing over time, as you would expect, right? As we get more wind and solar coming on the system every year to meet climate mandates, then also renewable portfolio standard requirements. And also, I should say, corporate, voluntary buying. And just kind of maybe normalize this a bit. This is in megawatt hours. The highest bar over there on the far right for 2021, that equates to about a 40 megawatt, let's say, solar farm that is being curtailed on a regular basis because of the inability to have storage. And the key is that as we go to 60% to 100% renewable someday, the need to store that energy is going to be more and more important. So can we go to the next slide? So this is hydrogen in transportation. And this slide is certainly not comprehensive. I mean, I'm focused mainly on carbon pricing support for hydrogen in the transportation sector. And so, covering the RFS program, the Federal Renewable Fuel Standard Program, and then the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program. But, at the outset, I should say there are other ways that hydrogen is being supported, in the transportation sector. And that would be, but most notably, the ZEV mandates, so zero emission vehicle sales mandates, and then also zero emission vehicle purchase mandates. So some of you have probably seen, CARB, is California Air Resources Board, is kind of leading the charge on this. So you have the Advanced Clean Cars program, which is a mandate to produce zero emission vehicles, and that includes electricity, battery electric vehicles, and then of course also hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And then there's the Advanced Clean Trucks program, which was adopted by CARB last summer, which is the same type of phase-in program for manufacturers, but again, focused on trucks, so medium, heavy-duty trucks. And then CARB is working on an Advanced Clean Fleets program, which is like the companion to the Advanced Clean Trucks. The idea is that they would flange up those two programs, so manufacturers would produce the ZEV trucks, and then fleets would have to buy them. So you'd have sort of a matching in theory. So those are very important supports for hydrogen in the transportation sector. But I want to talk a little bit more about more direct support, for folks producing hydrogen and using hydrogen as transportation fuel. So the LCFS supports hydrogen in the three different ways. If you produce hydrogen and supply it to the California market directly for direct use as transportation fuel, you can get LCFS credits. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this chart above. This is the pricing chart. The LCFS is a very substantial price support. Prices have come down about $15 in the last month, which is interesting, but they're still about $175 a ton, which is very substantial in terms of a carbon price support. You can also get credits for producing hydrogen. I'd say let's think about it as a feedstock. So a lot of petroleum refineries, produce hydrogen on site or adjacent to the facility to hydrogenate the fuel. So the petroleum refinery is using very large volumes of hydrogen. The idea is if you can clean up that production process in some way, produce what they call renewable hydrogen, then you can get, LCFS credits in a more indirect fashion, but there's still, credits there for that approach. And that can be hydrogen from, green hydrogen, we should say, which is, I guess we should talk about the colors. The color wheel for hydrogen, you have green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, even turquoise hydrogen. So gray hydrogen is traditionally produced hydrogen, so steam methane reforming. Blue hydrogen is capturing the CO2 stream from traditional production of hydrogen and sequestering it. And then green hydrogen is taking renewable electricity, doing electrolysis and producing hydrogen. Now there's different flavors of that, but that's the basic sort of color scheme for hydrogen. So you can produce green hydrogen or blue hydrogen for petroleum refineries, and then that would generate LCFS credits. Lastly, it's really interesting is that the Air Resources Board put into the program an ability to get LCFS credits for building hydrogen, basic pumps, refueling stations. Doesn't matter if anybody uses the pumps. It doesn't matter have the volume of hydrogen being dispensed. It's really just we want to provide incentive for folks to build this infrastructure. This is sort of a chicken and the egg thing. We want the infrastructure there with the hope that will, catalyze more zero emission vehicle adoption and use down the line. So that there's what we call a capacity crediting program, the HRI program for hydrogen. So I'll hit RFS very quickly. The RFS support is more hypothetical at this point. There's this nesting regime that I have on the screen here for different types of RINs, the renewable identification numbers in the program. So in theory, there should be a way to get a hydrogen based RIN if you took a biogenic feedstock. So let's think of it as biogas, renewable natural gas, and made hydrogen from that, and then use that for transportation. And you should be able to get a RIN for that, which is an important pricing support as well. Not quite as lucrative as the LCFS, but still important. But I think as of today, and the audience should correct me if I've missed this, but I don't think there's been a pathway approved by EPA yet for a hydrogen RIN. So let's go to the next slide, Patty, please. I'll touch on industrial processes a little bit. So a very complicated image there. But I think it does a good job of encapsulating, the different ways that folks are thinking about how hydrogen can help decarbonize really the world economy. And you can see, there's the power sector, transportation, industrial, hydrogen as a very important role potentially in fertilizer production, so the agricultural sector. And there's a lot of uses that folks are exploring and pursuing actually commercially now. For hydrogen, and I should say that Latham is working on some of those projects. What's great about hydrogen is it can burn very, very hot, and of course, when it burns, it has zero emissions, right? If you burn hydrogen, you're just getting water vapor, right? Some of you may remember the scene in the movie The Martian with Matt Damon, where he needs water, and so he has a lot of rocket fuel, basically hydrogen, and so he burns the hydrogen to produce water vapor and then collects the water so he has something to drink on Mars when he's stranded there. So that's sort of the idea. The great thing about hydrogen is that it really is a clean burning, a zero emission fuel. The key is how is that fuel produced? But there are certain sectors of the economy. Think about steel production, most notably cement production. You need really, really high temperatures. And that's one thing that hydrogen can do. Hydrogen can achieve those very high temperatures. And so it's going to be, while there are some indirect pricing supports now, for example, the cap and trade program in California, essentially economy-wide, placing a carbon price on industrial processes. It's not a huge incentive today, but still there's an incentive to do fuel switching, potentially to hydrogen. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens in different states, regionally, nationally, internationally, as countries are rethinking how do we support hydrogen. Where's the best place to use hydrogen? How do we smartly deploy this clean fuel? So it's a lot to track there. It's going to be legislation. It's going to be regulatory processes. And unfortunately, probably eventually litigation as well. But all this will get sorted out, and we'll see. It'll be interesting to track what happens to hydrogen and what role it plays in decarbonizing the world economy. And with that, let me flip it to Mark. And Mark, I know you were tied up on a client call. So what we're doing is we're kind of doing brief introductions before we start our sessions. And so maybe if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, and then maybe jump into your slides.
Cool. Hey everybody, good to see you. See a lot of familiar names as well. I love Josh's daughter coming in during the presentation. That's fantastic. Very live at home. Hopefully my dog starts barking in the middle of this. But anyway, I work closely with Jim and Josh on a number of things. I am right down the hall from Josh, 2 doors down, and we work on all kinds of matters back when we were in the office well over a year ago. But my primary practice, I'm in the environmental land and resources group at Latham, large scale energy infrastructure and traditional development projects such as a real estate development. Do a lot of work involving CEQA, NEPA, and related underlying issues. And I'm going to be talking about a CEQA issue today involving climate change, energy, air quality. Wildfires has become a major issue. And what I'm speaking about today, could we get the next slide? is a court case that overturned a recent decision on climate change grounds. Oh, and I'll mention too that I was actually a CEQA and NEPA consultant before beginning to practice law. And what's interesting about that is sort of having the technical background and like with Josh is that so many of these issues, where legal and technical issues become closely intertwined. And I mean, I think it makes kind of what the work we do and the folks on this call really fascinating. This is the Centennial Tejon Ranch project I'm going to talk about here briefly. I wasn't involved. Latham isn't involved in this case. And the only reason we're really bringing it up on this is one of the key holdings in the decision involved climate change. And folks on this call will be very interested in kind of the rationale behind it. Also discuss wildfire as well, which I'm going to touch on briefly at the end, just kind of the interlap and the overlap of these issues. I think is really fascinating. But for folks, I don't want to immediately just jump in. And I apologize. I probably should have added a slide or two on this, but just in terms of, why are we talking about this? This is, and I think a couple years ago at the conference, we actually had a workshop just focused on CEQA and kind of the overlap of CEQA and, the carbon markets and climate change regulation in general. So the California Environmental Quality Act, as I'm sure many of you know, it's kind of the California's sister version of NEPA. Similar to NEPA, it tends to be even more litigious, there's a bit more teeth to it in terms of what agencies need to find before approving a CEQA document. And in California, much like throughout the United States on NEPA documents, in California, it's the road. In a CEQA document, that's where a project will get litigated. That's where you can have a broader concept like climate change and state climate policy gets applied down to a very micro scale on a particular project. Here we're talking about a massive project, a project for 19,000 homes in North LA County, but it could also just be a new gas station or a new Target or whatever it is on the corner of X and Y street, right? And so one of the issues that's been heavily, climate change and the analysis of whether an individual project, whether it's a single home or a 19,000 home community, has a significant impact on global climate change, has been an area of intense controversy and litigation for well over a decade. And this is just maybe the latest chapter in that. And I don't anticipate that going away for two reasons. One is that it remains to be a challenging issue where even a massive project, it's just an extremely small amount of emissions compared to the region, let alone the state, let alone the world. So it's hard to clearly identify what is significant. Unlike you might have like a noise standard, you could come up with a decibel threshold, something of that sort. The other is that the way the regulations are rolled out, and this is what we'll talk about in this case, it's just interesting, is they tend to be generally applicable regulations or focused on a sector. Like, there's the state has had incredible success recognizing the electricity sector, right? With the RPS and a number of measures in the boom of solar and wind. But the applicability of like the RPS to an individual project is less clear. The third point why I think this will just continue to be, climate change will continue to and not that it in and of itself does, is because it intertwines with so many other issues. And I'm going to touch briefly on wildfire at the end. So that preamble, I'll kind of just give a quick summary of this case. And what the kind of the crux here was that, again, this was a very large project, almost 20,000 homes, 10 million square feet of commercial, almost essentially a new small city on in North LA County. For folks familiar, it's kind of when you're going down the Grapevine from if you're heading north out of LA into more of the Central Valley. And there's a lot of open space, a lot of area would be preserved, but a number of areas would be developed. Was litigated. Can I get the next slide, please? And the court overturned the environmental impact report analysis that needs to be done under CEQA And by overturning it, essentially is requiring the developer to go back to LA County for new approvals. And one of the key issues for the project was that the project, as part of the EIR, reduced its greenhouse gas emissions, like its assumed emissions for the project, to zero. But by relying first on indirectly relying on the cap and trade coverage for the cap and trade program that applies statewide to reduce the project level emissions. And you'll see in that second bullet, it was very significant. And I'll explain this a bit more what I mean. But instead of the project having an annual emissions about 150,000 metric tons per year of CO2 equivalent, it went all the way down to less than 7,000. So what this analysis was that the EIR essentially calculated using a fairly standard methodology that folks like me that work with SQL all the time are familiar with to estimate the project's emissions. And it's the same model, Cali mod, that you would look at to estimate the NOx emissions or PM10 emissions. But of those emissions, of the number there, 150,000 tons per year, about 96% of those were emissions, whether they're from mobile sources or homes burning or natural gas, et cetera, using electricity or burning natural gas, that would be emissions that would be coming from a covered sector under the cap and trade. So, your refineries or your electricity providers, the utilities, et cetera, already are having to comply with cap and trade regulations, and the cap and trade and the other requirements under SB 32 are driving down addressing those emissions in accordance with state climate policy. So what the EIR did was essentially say those 96% of those emissions are already being by statewide programs. We only need to focus with this very small, the 4% that what's remaining. And this has been an issue that's been debated for over a decade. Most documents tend not to do this, but this document, perhaps because of the size of the project, did do so. The court rejected that approach, and it kind of gets into the weeds of why. But the way the CEQA set up is that essentially, if for a project that is directly covered by a regulated program, you could rely on that program. But here, this project is a standard land use development project. Could you switch to the next slide, please? So unlike maybe a refinery or utility that's directly related, this is just a land use project that was indirectly relying on the regulation that covered another entity. And the court said that just is not a permissible approach. The court also was persuaded by input from CARB's executive officer that said that this just simply wasn't the legislative attempt. That the cap and trade program was not intended to apply to land use projects. If you also look at CARB's scoping plan, there's sort of the cap and trade doesn't sort of cover everything, and then land use is ignored. There's very sort of a clear, there's the RPS, there's all these measures. Cap and trade is one of the strategies to reduce the state's emissions. But then there's a whole nother basket of strategies focused on land use related items, like encouraging infill and reducing vehicle miles travel, and a wide number of measures that are that CARB has identified as being necessary to meet the state's climate goals, even if cap and trade remains in effect. And in reaching this decision, the court distinguished from another court case that it's essentially upheld an EIR that took this approach. I mean, kind of the difference there was that case involved a proposed, I believe it was a refinery, but it was definitely an industrial source that was directly regulated under the cap and trade program. So the court drew sort of a clean distinction from that. And I just will point out, this has gotten a lot of news for folks that are in California. I'm sure you caught it. Front page on the LA Times. There's an OC Register article that contrasted this project to the Newhall Ranch Valencia project that had a net zero GHG program that the state approved and had a different approach, didn't take the approach we're talking about here, and that was brought up in the litigation. Could I get the next slide, please? So just, a takeaway, and this was actually, I have to confess, a slide that sort of I borrowed from a recent presentation we gave on CEQA and looking back last year at CEQA and looking forward, to next year. But, I was reminded as I was putting this together, just really the overlap here, right? Like this isn't just if you're really kind of into the weeds on CEQA or this particular holding, but climate change, and this group being a climate-focused conference and a number of folks that are focused on climate issues, really has it's one of these overlapping umbrella themes in CEQA where it just keeps coming up again and again. And these were the topics that I brought up. I mean, CEQA reform, maybe not directly relevant here, but that the housing crisis, climate change, and the use of offsets directly relevant. Wildfire risk. So the reason I bring this up now is that wildfire was the other reason that the court overturned the Tejon Ranch EIR that I mentioned. And in some ways, wildfire is a distinct issue, but as we know, also the effects of climate change are exacerbating wildfire risks. And California has had some of the most intense wildfire, like last year, for example, 5 of the largest wildfires history of the state were burning at the same time, I think as around February of last year. And so the effects of climate change and the driver of climate change not only is relevant in terms of the climate change analysis and technical questions like the ones I just mentioned, but it's going to have ripple effects on other issues. Like if you look at the next topic that was again on my what to look for presentation that I gave a month ago is VMT and vehicle traveled. And the whole purpose of the new vehicle miles traveled paradigm and rules for analyzing traffic impacts was to drive, infill development, reduce trips, and reduce emissions, both from criteria pollutants, but very much so from greenhouse gases as well. So with that, I will wrap up and turn it back to Jim or Josh, or maybe to open up for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think folks may see the code on their screen now, should there be any lawyers on the line that would like some credit in California. I think we have one question that I've seen come across the chat, and so maybe we can address that one first, and then I'll ask our host here on the platform, Climate Action Reserve, whether there's a way to open it up to others, if others are allowed to speak if they have questions, and maybe we can have more of an interactive session. But so Jim, this one I think is directed at you, and Mark and I may supplement as we both play a bit in this space. But the question is from Andy Katz, and he's asking, what are the MRV requirements associated with 45Q tax credits?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So the MRV requirements that the IRS requires two things for storage. It requires compliance with the UIC program. If you are sequestering or using in an EOR project, it requires compliance with subpart RR, which is what dictates the MRV requirements. They are no different under 45Q than they are under subpart RR in general. So I think whatever the MRV plan looks like that you would, otherwise submit to comply with subpart RR will look very similar here. The one distinction is that if you have an EOR project, you are also permitted to comply with an alternative standard. It's a very long string of letters and numbers that I candidly can't recall off the top of my head. It's an ISO, ISO, followed by then a bunch of other letters and numbers. The punchline on that one is that it doesn't require public reporting, whereas my understanding is that the MRV plan, the EPA will disclose publicly, CO2 that's sequestered under that plan. So I think that is the distinction, is you could have an EOR project that gets away with reporting to the IRS, but doesn't have to report publicly. Whereas for any other projects, you would anticipate reporting publicly. Now, Josh, Mark, anything else to add on that one?
Yeah. And so thanks, Jim. And I think the cross reference there, right, from the IRS regs to EPA regs, those are the EPA greenhouse gas reporting program regs. And Jim is mentioning, RR, but I mean, there's all sorts of letters and double letters for the EPA greenhouse gas reporting program. And so basically this IRS is incorporating by reference the subpart RR requirements for reporting geological sequestration of CO2. One other thing I'll note, which is sort of a corollary to the question and the answer, is we've been talking about sequestration, but the tax credit does allow for utilization, as Jim touched on earlier. And so if you're going to do a utilization project, so again, not storing the CO2 underground, but putting it into some sort of commercial product, again, very broadly defined, I think, you have to do a life cycle analysis on that commercial product. And that has to be approved by the IRS. And I believe the Department of Energy will support the IRS in the valuation of that life cycle to make sure, I think basically that there's a carbon reduction benefit for that utilization of the captured CO2.
Yeah, that's right, Josh. That's exactly right.
Let's see. So I don't know if anybody on from Climate Action Reserve, is there a way to open up the questions? Can people raise their hands, or should we ask people just to put stuff in the chat? And I hope I'm not asking that question into the void. There's no one there to respond. Let me see.
I see one for Mark on the chat now.
Oh, you do? All right, let me check.
Oh, is that right? Let me see. Oh, yeah, there it is.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good question. What do you see for the future of CEQA mitigation in light of the Tejon decision? Great question. I focused on climate change, and so there's two issues. One is wildfire, and two is the climate change holding. But from a legal standpoint, and I apologize if I didn't mention this earlier, this is a superior court trial court decision, so it's directly relevant to the folks at issue. The developers, the county, the project opponents that brought the litigation. It doesn't have any legal precedent unless it's appealed, and then maybe if there's a similar holding, or sometimes the Court of Appeal will go in a totally different direction. But then that becomes a published decision. But I do think these are trends that are consistent with what we've seen, as I said, for over a decade, and that there's been, the use of this approach under CEQA, carries the risks that were highlighted in this decision, right? That a court would just find that the cap and trade program is not directly applicable to a land use project. So that brings up the question here about what mitigation would be required. And I think kind of the key thing that we've seen is a distinction between how much mitigation one is the amount of mitigation that's needed, and that will vary depending on the project and the threshold that's being imposed. And then two, of that mitigation, how much of it has to be on-site or local versus off-site, right? And that's we've had entire conferences on, the use of offsets, for example, because in the climate world, you could purchase or develop offsets that could be international in nature, and from a climate perspective, it more than addresses from a mitigation standpoint and emissions that you're putting into the global atmosphere of greenhouse gases. But for a variety of reasons under CEQA, including, I think, the last point on my slide in terms of what to look forward to, over the last decade and accelerated into recent years, there's been a growing concern about marrying climate mitigation with co-benefits, primarily reducing criteria pollutants of particulate matter. So there's been a strong drive to reduce emissions, not just generally, in terms of focusing on global climate change, but focusing on local or at least regional reductions that have some type of co-benefit. And so the local community benefits, not just from a climate standpoint, but also from a criteria pollutant standpoint. But great question, and we could, have a hard, healthy dialogue on that, or entire discussion. Jim or Josh, I know that Josh, this is an area you spend a lot of time thinking about as well.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think on the side for the GHG mitigation, I mean, what we're seeing is enhanced scrutiny and pressure on development projects in California and really across the country, as regulators think about, like, and not just regulators, legislators think about who has to do what to achieve, climate stability, climate stabilization, and what role does the land use sector play. It's a difficult thing to regulate, right? Because the decisions are made on a hyper local way. And so the question is, what must a city do? What must a county do as they approve projects? And how does that interact with overarching regulatory regimes to address GHG emissions? So the challenge, frankly, when you're developing something today, particularly in California, is you have to have a landscape view of what's happening, and what may happen. Look in your crystal ball and say, what is the state going to do 2, 3, 4 years from now? What is the state's plan to decarbonize? Is my project consistent? And, what type of features, are going to be imposed on me under green building codes, and what should I do maybe above and beyond for my project? So, I mean, it's one of these things. I guess what I'll say is you have to be constantly attuned to what's happening with your project, because, as Mark explained, the world is changing on a regular basis. And so you're going to want to stay alert to make sure that you have the most up-to-date information and you have the most up-to-date strategy for mitigating your project submissions. And with that, actually, I see another question here on 45Q in the chat. And I don't know, Jim, I'll flip it to you. That one may be for me too, but I don't know if you want to handle that one, Jim.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly, supplement again. The regulations, are actually pretty broad and pretty vague on what exactly the life cycle analysis requires. So I pulled them up while I was listening to Mark and Josh speak, and it says, you have to report greenhouse gas emissions related to the full product life cycle, including all stages, through the ultimate consumer and end user. So I think, William, I'd interpret that as including the end of life use, sort of the way you phrased your question. What they don't tell you is, what is a submission that, analyzes that life cycle? What does that actually look like? And what will be ultimately sufficient for the DOE or the IRS for this purpose? You do have to get a third-party review. So I think, the market will probably settle out with companies that are, out there that are capable of conducting this sort of analysis. And there'll become a few players, like in most spaces. But right now, I think that's still up in the air. I don't know, Josh, anything else on that?
No, you nailed it. There's nothing else I need to say there, except hope you're doing well. Hope you and all the folks at Climeco are doing well. I hope we can interact over the next few days of the conference. I'm now scrolling for other questions. I'm not seeing any at the moment. I wonder if I should play the role of moderator for a second and throw some questions at Mark or at Jim. I mean, Jim,
softballs, only softballs.
Well, you're in Houston, right? So should I bang the trash can so you know what pitch is coming? And then, okay. Sorry, a little baseball joke there. I wonder if you might be able to opine just a little bit, give a little color on, because we're working on some CCS projects, right? And, without obviously getting too many details, what you're hearing in terms of, how the market is viewing the importance of the 45Q credit, how it, stacks up, versus other incentives. Just sort of maybe a little color on what you're hearing, because this is sort of, and maybe even what may be to come was a lot of chatter about the nature of the tax credit being extended or changing.
Sure.
Anything like that, I think, might be interesting to the audience.
Yeah, so I think the observation I'd make, at least on the early projects, is that nearly every project is looking to stack benefits. So they're looking for both 45Q and typically LCFS, but some other climate benefit. The way that I have thought about the is that the 45Q credit is the tool with which you build the project, with which you finance it. And the LCFS or the other benefit is really your revenue driver from the project. So what I mean by that is in the renewable energy space, in particular wind and solar and what's being adopted in 45Q, the typical construct is that you use project-specific non-recourse financing to construct the project. And then tax equity, at the time you sign up that financing, will sign up a forward commitment to fund upon completion of, 50 conditions, right? One of which is, placed in service, that you have the sufficient permits, that you have for 45Q, that you have your MRV in place, all of those sort of things. The construction lenders, though, are relying heavily on tax equity as their takeout because their financing is not intended to be permanent. So what we found as projects have started to develop is that the financing that you can realize off of the 45Q credits is, typically enough to cover 100% of the construction price if you were to finance all 12 years of credits. So we've seen projects that are able to finance between 6 and 10 years of credits and still pay for effectively 100% of the construction loan. So you always have a little equity slug as the developer, but you can effectively pay off the loan with not even the full set of tax credits. So what that means is you use the tax credits as your financing tool, and then any FS or any other state benefit, that's all revenue in your pocket that you get to keep on the top. And so that's the strategy, at least as an early stage, that we've seen most of these projects deploying.
Well, thanks, Jim. That was great. Not seeing any other questions, and we're at the hour, and I wonder if we should give people a minute back of their lives and potentially end early here. So I guess let me thank the Climate Action Reserve again for hosting us. I mean, we're delighted to do the legal workshop. Hopefully we can do it in person next year and have it for our typical 3 hours or so. I'm sure there'll be new and emerging issues that we'll need to cover next year. But thanks again for everyone that joined to watch the session today. And our contact information is on the screen there. So if anybody wants to talk to us offline, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I think we'll close and hope to see you guys around at the rest of the conference.
All right. Thank you.